We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Tes Amud Aleph in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 79a. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said, let's say you have a situation where a father appoints a shliach in order to be Mekadesh his daughter, and then he goes ahead and he accepts the Kiddushin on behalf of his daughter. We don't know which one of them accepted the Kiddushin first. Was it the shliach that he appointed, or was it him that accepted the Kiddushin first? So in such a situation, it is a suffix, and Shnehem Nosnim get, so they both have to give a get to the girl. Rashi says, Shneim nosnin get, in basli nasilacha, meaning if she wants to marry someone else, she doesn't know right now which Kiddushin was effective, so they both have to give a get. And the Mishnah continues, V'yamurotzu, but if they want, echad nosin get, v'echad kones, so one could give a get and the other one could marry her. And the Mishnah continues along the same lines, V'chein ha'isha shenasna reshus l'shalucha l'kadsha. Similarly, let's say a woman gives permission to her shliach, again, to accept a Kiddushin on her behalf. V'holcha v'kidcha satzma, then she goes ahead and she accepts a Kiddushin on her own behalf. Im shalah kidmu kiddusha Kiddushin, if her acceptance was the one that was first, then her Kiddushin is a good Kiddushin. V'im shel shlucha kidmu, but if the shliach, if his was first on her behalf, so then Kiddushav Kiddushin, then it's his Kiddushin, that is a good Kiddushin. And the Mishnah finishes the same way it just said above. Im einon yodin, if they don't know which one was first, shneim nosnim laget, they both give her a get. V'im rotzu, but if they want, echad nosin laget, v'echad kones, one can give her a get, and one can marry her. And the Gemara says, Utsricha, both cases in the Mishnah are necessary, meaning to say you have the case where the father accepts for his daughter, but also appoints a shliach, and you also have a case of the woman accepting for herself, but also appoints a shliach. We need both of those cases. And the Gemara explains, because let's say we only had it by him, by the case of the father, mishum de gavra kim le biyuchsim, because a man, he understands lineage. We'll see Rashi on that in a moment. Avol itza de lo kimla biyuchsin emo lo nehave kiddusha kiddushin. But let's say when it comes to a woman, she's not so certain when it comes to issues of lineage. Maybe we would say her kiddushin is not a kiddushin. V'yashminan gabi deda. And let's say we only had the case, the second case of the Mishnah, the case where she accepts the kiddushin and a shliach accepts it. Mishum de itza daiko mitzvah. So there you say that the woman actually is more careful when she's the one getting married, because she's actually the one getting married. Avol iu. But when it comes to him, the father, on behalf of his daughter, he might not be as careful. Maybe he doesn't care as much. So tzricha, that's why it's necessary to teach both cases. And Rashi explains, Mishum de Gavra Kimle B'Yuchsin, again, the Gemara said that the first case, I would say, the father is somebody, the man is somebody who understands Yuchsin, and the idea is as follows. So therefore, when it turns out he finds a woman, he finds somebody who is good Yichus for his daughter, so then Kitchelo, so then he'll do the Kiddushin. The point is that the father will then nullify the shliach. The point over here is that when the father actually accepts a kiddushin for his daughter, so there it makes sense to say that if he is first, he was totally mevatel the shliach. It wasn't like conditional. It wasn't like he was saying, I'm accepting this kiddushin on the assumption the shliach won't find somebody, but if the shliach finds somebody, then I want his kiddushin. That's not the case. When it comes to the father, I would say he was certainly mevatel the shliach because he's very careful to find someone with good yichus. Avol itza, but maybe when it comes to the woman, and she doesn't know so much about lineage. So I might think even if she accepted the kiddushin first, lo bitlas hashliach, maybe she wasn't totally mevatel the shliach. Again, maybe it was like a conditional kind of thing. V'lo samchal kiddusha, she wasn't really relying on her kiddushin. The savra dilma shliach mishkach miyuchas mizeh, because she's thinking maybe the shliach will find somebody who's better, and therefore that's why I might think again by the woman it is different. But you could also go the other way, since the woman is the one actually getting married. She's more careful, but when it comes to the father, maybe he doesn't care. He doesn't care exactly who his daughter marries, how much yichus he has. And again, so maybe it's the father that doesn't nullify the shliach. Even let's say he gives her away to somebody who has worse yichus, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe again, he accepted the kiddushin first because he wasn't sure if the shliach would find anyone. Maybe it was conditional. But if the shliach should find someone, so then he wasn't mevatel. That's why we need both cases to say no. In both situations, whoever was first, that kiddushin is going to be a good kiddushin. If the father was first, his shliach is batel. If the woman herself was first, in the second case of the Mishnah, then her shliach is going to be batel. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, it was stated the following machlokas amoraim, Kitsha avia b'derech, let's say her father accepts a kiddushin on her behalf on the road, the Kitsha atzma ba'ir, then later that day, she accepts a kiddushin for herself in the city, v'harehi bogeres, and then we investigate, we see if she has the full signs of maturity, and it turns out she is a bogeres at the time that she accepted the Kiddushin for herself. And the halacha would be that if she was a bogeres when the father tried to accept the Kiddushin on her behalf, that would not be a good Kiddushin. Once she's a bogeres, she is outside of the reshus of her father, and if he accepts the Kiddushin on her behalf, it's nothing. Now, in standard situations, we'll see this as the Gemara goes on. In standard situations, when a girl is 12 years old, she's what's called a nara. She is considered an adult, but she's still under the reshus of her father. And then when she's 6 months later, at 12 and a half years old, she's considered a bogeres. But again, let's say before that 6 months, if she has the full signs of maturity, so then she's also considered a bogeres as well. Rashi says, again, V'kit shehi bo'ir, so then she accepts a Kiddushin for herself in the city, bo bayom, on that same day. It's a little later on the same day. V'harehi bogeres, and it turns out she's a bogeres. Bidaknuha l'dasim yotzim min hashasav. In other words, at that time, they actually checked her to see if she was a bogeres and she was no longer in the reshus of her father. Leo's Kiddushin. We want to find out, is her Kiddushin the Kiddushin, and is her father's not a Kiddushin? Umitzanu bogeres bo bayom, and they find out that indeed she was a bogeres on that day, so she was certainly a bogeres at the time that she accepted the Kiddushin, but the question is, was she a bogeres earlier at the time the father accepted the Kiddushin on her behalf? That's what it means, v'harehi bogeres. And so again, here we have a machlokas amoraim as follows. Rav Amar Rav says, Harehi bogeres lefanenu. She's a bogeres in front of us. What that means to say is that since right now she's a bogeres, we assume that she was a bogeres earlier that day as well, and the father's Kiddushin is not going to be a good Kiddushin. Ushmuel Amar, but Shmuel says, Chashinam l'Kiddushay Shneim. We have a real suffix over here. It could be she was not a bogeres earlier in the day. Maybe the father's Kiddushin was good, and so we have a suffix. We have to assume that maybe the father's was a good Kiddushin, or maybe her acceptance was a good Kiddushin. It's considered to be a suffix. As Rashi explains, Chashinam l'Kiddushay Shneim, we have to be concerned for both Kiddushins. Shemu k'shekit sho'av, maybe at the time that the father accepted the Kiddushin on her behalf, Nara haisa, maybe she wasn't a bogeres, maybe she was a Nara. The Kidmu Kiddushav, then his Kiddushin came first, and his Kiddushin would be Chal. That's the machlokas Rav and Shmuel, and the main idea over here is Rav uses this logic of Harehi bogeres lefanenu. Whatever we see in front of us now, so then it's like a chazaka dehashta, it's like a presumption what she is right now, that's what she was earlier, and Shmuel says there is no such chazaka. Now the Gemara clarifies the nature of the machlokas. The Gemara says, Emas, when exactly is all this occurring, meaning to say, how old is this girl? Ilema b'soch shish, if you're going to say that it's within that 6-month period, so b'han neima Rav harei bogeres lefanenu, would Rav say in such a situation 6 months haven't even gone by yet from the time that she was 12? Would he say that she's a bogeres right in front of us and therefore she was a bogeres earlier? That wouldn't make sense. Hashtahu debagar, there we certainly would say that it's a possibility, at least like Shmuel, it's a possibility that right now she became a bogeres. There's no way that Rav would say before the 6 months are up, there's no way he would say that it is certain that we can rely with certainty on the fact that she was a bogeres earlier. Would certainly be at least a suffix, like Shmuel says. And then the Gemara says, Elalachar shisha, but then you'll say, okay, this is taking place after 6 months. But that also doesn't make sense. Then she's certainly a bogeres. B'han name of Shmuel chayshinon l'kiddushay shneim, would Shmuel say in this case that we have to be concerned with both Kiddushin? Certainly her Kiddushin is effective, and the father's is not. Because we know Shmuel himself said, V'amar Shmuel, but Shmuel said, Ein bein narus l'bagris, ela shisha chadashim bilvad. There's no amount of time between narus and bagris. The amount of time is 6 months, meaning to say, if 6 months go by, according to Shmuel, she is certainly a bogeres, and so therefore there will be no reason to say there is a doubt. And so the Gemara says Rav and Shmuel are arguing in a very specific case. Lo no tzricha, the argument between Rav and Shmuel is needed in the following situation. To Kaddish Bahu Yuma Demashlim Shisha. What's going on is, it is that very day that's going to be the end of the 6 months. That's when all of this occurs. Rav Amar Harehi Bogeres Lefanenu. Rav says since it's that final day, so if she's a Bogeres in front of us right now, Midahashta Bogeres, from the fact that right now she's a Bogeres, B'tzafra Nami Bogeres. We assume that in the morning she was also a bogeres. Ushmuel Amar, and Shmuel says Hashtahu the Aisi Simonim. Maybe it was right now that she brought forth these Simonim. And so therefore that's the machlokas Rav and Shmuel. Again, Rav uses the logic of Harei Bogeres Lefanenu, and Shmuel does not follow that logic. And the Gemara continues, Shmuel Maishnami Mikvan, according to Shmuel, who does not agree with the concept of Harei Bogeres Lefanenu, he does not agree that we follow the Chazak at the Hashta. What's the difference between this case of Bogeres and the following Mishnah that deals with Mikvah? Tetanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Mikvah shenimdad v'nimtza chasr. Let's say they measure a Mikvah and they find out that it's missing water, they find out that it's not a kosher Mikvah. Kol ta'aro shenasu al gabav levafreya. So anything that you try to purify using that Mikvah going back until the last time when you knew for certain certain that it was a kosher mikveh. All of that time period, bein b'rishas hayachid, bein b'rishas harabim, it doesn't matter if you're in rishas hayachid, it doesn't matter if you're in rishas harabim. In situations of suffix by tumah, so in rishas hayachid we're usually machmir, in rishas harabim we're usually mekel, but over here the point of the mission is it's not a suffix at all. We have a chazaka that this mikveh is no good right now, and therefore it's like certainty that it's no good. Tameos, you say that everything is tameh. We understand it to be a certainty since right now it's chaser. You have to go all the way back to the last point in time we knew that it was a good mikveh, and that entire area of time when we're not sure, we consider it certainly not a kosher mikveh, and we say everything is tameh, and that seems exactly like Rav. The idea is harei chaser lefanenu, in the same way we say that harei hi bogeres lefanenu. And the Gemara answers on behalf of Shmuel, Shani Hasam, it's different over there by mikveh, the Ikol HaMeimar HaMeid Tameh Al Chezkaso, because there's another chazaka. You can say that everything that was Tameh had a chazaka, that it's Tameh, the Eimer Lo Tavel, and say that the Tvila was no good. And so therefore, since we have this chazaka of Tumah, that's why we're more strict when it comes to mikveh according to Shmuel. But the Gemara says, 1 second, that's not a good chazaka, Adrab, on the contrary. HaMeid Mikveh Al Chezkaso, didn't the mikveh at one point in time have a chazaka that it was kosher? The Eimer Lo Chaser, we should say that it didn't lose any water, we should say it was a kosher mikveh at the time that we're not sure. But the Gemara says to that, Harei chaser lefanecha. No, right in front of us it's chaser. You have a chazaka the hashda going the other way, so you wouldn't say that the mikveh has a chazaka that it's kosher. But the Gemara says, Hachanami, here also is the same thing. Harei bogeres lefanecha. You have again, she's in front of us, a bogeres, and over there, Shmuel doesn't agree with such logic. Hashtahu de bogra. So the Gemara says back to that, no, Shmuel says when it comes to bogeres, maybe it happened right now. Just because it's right now in front of us a bogeres doesn't mean we go back. But the Gemara says, Hasam Nami. But if that's true over there also, Hashtu the Chaser, maybe right now the mikveh was missing water. In other words, we're back to the original question. Both cases of the Bogeres and in the case of the mikveh, you can say the same argument. Right now in front of us, she's a Bogeres. Right now in front of us, the mikveh is Chaser. But when it comes to the Bogeres, Shmuel assumes that right now she became a Bogeres. Earlier, she may not have been a Bogeres. But when it comes to the mikveh, apparently we're assuming that this mikveh is no good with certainty. And finally, the Gemara answers on behalf of Shmuel very simply, Hasam Tarti L'Reyusa. When it comes to the mikveh, you have two things going against you. There are two strikes. Meaning to say, you have the idea, number one, there's the chazak of everything that is tameh. Everything had a presumption that it was tameh before it became tar. So that chazaka says that everything is tameh. And plus you have before us, Harei chaser lefanecha, right in front of us, this mikveh is chaser. That's the chazaka the hashta. So you have two chazakas that essentially are going against you and saying that we should understand that everything is tameh, so we say tameh. But hach over here, when it comes to the bogeres chadal reyusa, you only have one thing that's going against you. There's only one strike, meaning to say she's a bogeres right in front of us right now, and therefore that is telling us that the father's kiddushin might not be a good kiddushin. But again, maybe the father's kiddushin is a good kiddushin. You only have that one chazaka, so there Shmuel does not follow the chazaka. That's why Shmuel makes a distinction between the case of the mikveh and this case of the bogeres. And the Gemara continues along the same lines of Shmuel ma'ishna mechavis. But according to Shmuel, what are we going to do with the following case? The case of chavis. Titania, as we learned in a brayso, hayabodek es hachavis. Let's say the person is checking the barrel of wine. The case over here is that the person has one barrel of wine. He's using that, and he's going to designate eventually that entire barrel as truma for a bunch of other barrels of wine that he has. But the problem is that according to this Tan of the brayso, if that barrel of wine turned to vinegar, it's not going to be good truma because he can't separate from vinegar on other barrels of wine. So he's being bodek as hachavis. He's inspecting the chavis to see whether it's wine or whether it's vinegar. Lahafresh aleh truma. In order to separate truma, again, he's going to use this barrel of wine as his truma. V'holech v'achakach nimtzas chometz. And it turns out that in one of his inspections, he finds out that it is indeed vinegar. So the question is, how far back? Again, there's a window of time that we're not sure whether it was vinegar or not. And so the brayso says, kol gimel yomim, for the 3 days, vada. It's a certainty. You can assume that it's vinegar. There's a machlokas amoraim in a different sugya. There's a machlokas amoraim in Baba Basra, exactly what we mean by the 3 days. But the point here is, let's say 3 days from the time that he inspected and found it vinegar, we can assume with certainty that it was vinegar. Mikan va'elach safek, but then from there on, in any other window of time that we're not sure, we consider that a time of safek. We don't know whether it was yayin or chometz. And so the Gemara says, on that brayso, v'ramin on chavis ha-mikvah, we actually ask a kasha. We have the following contradiction. Why is this case of the barrel different than the case of the mikvah that we just quoted above? Ma'ishna dehacha vadai. What's the difference that over here here, we're saying vadai, meaning by the mikveh, we're saying it is certainly any time, any window of time that we're not sure, we say it is certainly not a good mikveh. But over here, when it comes to the barrel of wine, that window of time you have is considered a suffix. We don't know whether it was vinegar or wine. Why do we make a distinction between the case of the barrel and the case of the mikveh? And on that contradiction, on that question between the Braisa and the Mishnah by Mikvos, V'yomer Rav Chanina Misuria, so Rav Chanina Misuria said, Man Tana Chavis, you know who the author is of this Braisa by the barrel of wine, happens to be, there's another Tana that disagrees by mikveh. The Tana is Rabbi Shimon, it's actually Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon disagrees with the Mishnah we just quoted above by mikveh. The Gabe mikveh nami sveika mashvi. It happens to be that Rabbi Shimon says in the case of the mikveh as well, we consider it a suffix. Where does Rabbi Shimon say this? The Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, this Braisa as well as the Braisa of Chavis comes from Tosefta. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, called taros shenasu al gabav. Any taros that you did. Again, this is talking about the case of the mikveh, where we found out the mikveh was missing water, and now you have a whole window of time. You don't know whether the mikveh was kosher or not. So the Braisa here again says, anything that you did that you tried to purify through that mikveh, limafreya, going back, bein rishos hayachid, bein rishos harabim, tameos, whether in rishos hayachid, whether in rishos harabim, it's tameos. That's the same as the shita in the Mishnah. This Tanakam of the Braisa is the same as the Mishnah we quoted above. But in this Braisa, it brings Rabbi Shimon. For Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon says, b'rishos harabim tahoros, b'rishos hayachid. When it comes to Rishos Harabim, so then we say pure. In other words, we treat it like a suffix. When you have a suffix tum in Rishos Harabim, we say it's pure. But Rishos Hayachid, Tolin. But when you're in Rishos Hayachid, so then Tolin means to say that we really don't know. It's considered to be a suffix. We have to be concerned that maybe it was no good. Maybe all of these items are actually Tameh. So that's Rabbi Shimon's Shita. So since Rabbi Shimon says it's a suffix when it comes to mikveh, Rabbi Shimon also says that it's a suffix when it comes to chavis. And so the point of the Gemara is we can then understand Avol Rabbanan, if that is the case. If according to Rabbi Shimon, that's what Rabbi Shimon would say in the case of chavis, so what would the Rabbanan say in the case of chavis? According to the Rabbanan, they would obviously treat the case of chavis exactly the same as the case of mikveh. Avol Rabbanan, Tavel Mafreya. But according to the Rabbanan, apparently they would say that it is a certainty that everything is going to be tevel. You have to assume it was chometz going all the way back through that window of time that we're not sure, and therefore everything that you tried to say was truma is actually going to be tevel. And so therefore we have the same exact question. Why is it that the Rabbanan say over here that we say again by the case of the chavis, just like by the case of the mikveh, we say harei lefonenu. Right now it's in front of us chometz, and therefore it's considered to be chometz going all the way back. Why do we say that? We don't say that by the bogeres. And the Gemara is going to answer along the same lines. Shani Hasam, it's different over there. The Ikolamemar Hamid Tevel al Chezkas. Again, there's another chazaka. The chazaka is that the food in front of us had a chazaka of tevel, so it's considered to be tevel. Ve'emer lo niskun. Therefore, we should say that it wasn't fixed properly. And the Gemara continues again along the same lines as before. Adrab, on the contrary, Hamid Yayin al Chezchaso. Doesn't the wine have a chazaka that it was good wine? Ve'emer lo hechmetz. Maybe we should say it didn't become chometz. It's not vinegar. And again, the Gemara says harei hechmetz lefanecha. No, so for that, right in front of us right now, it's vinegar. It's a chazaka dehashta. You do have to assume that it's going that it was vinegar earlier. And so again, the Gemara asks if you're going to use the logic of Harei Hechmetz Lefonecha, Hachanami, here also, Harei Hi Bogeres Lefonenu, use the logic of Rav, she's a Bogeres in front of us. And to that Shmuel will say, Hashtahu de Bagra, no, maybe it was just right now that she became a Bogeres. The Gemara says, Hasamnami, Hashtahu de Achmetz, well, maybe that's true over there also. Maybe right now it just became Chometz. And again, the Gemara answers same way as before, Hasam Tarti L'Reyusa, over there, when it comes to the case of the chavis of that barrel of the wine, you have two strikes. You have number one, that right in front of us it's chometz, and number two, all of those items had a chazaka that they were tevel, all of that previous wine that you tried to use this barrel of wine to separate truma. So therefore you have Tarti L'Reyusa, and therefore we say that's why we assume that everything is tevel. But over here again by the Bogeres, Chad L'Reyusa hu di'ika, so you only have a situation of one Reyusa, you only have a situation of one strike, that it's a Bogeres Lefonenu, and therefore Shmuel says just because it's Bogeres Lefonenu doesn't mean we know for certainty that she was a Bogeres earlier. Shmuel says you have to consider it to be a suffix. And the Gemara continues, Nema ketanoi, let us say this machlokas between Rav and Shmuel is actually a machlokas tanoim, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Tes Amud Beis.